Welcome back. The Supreme Court's overturning of Roe v. Wade sparked national conversation on the state of women's reproductive rights. Law professor for CUNY Law Natalie Gomez-Velez joins us to discuss the effects this ban will have on women and young girls throughout America. Professor, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me. Good to be here.
So as I mentioned, we all know about the decision the Supreme Court came up with. Can you explain what that means for our country?
The Supreme Court's decision in the Dobbs case overturns Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood v. Casey. In those cases, more than 50 years ago, Roe v. Wade established a fundamental right to abortion that was based on a liberty interest. And Casey, Planned Parenthood v. Casey, reaffirmed that right about 30 years ago, establishing again a fundamental right under the United States Constitution's 14th Amendment due process clause. And when we say a fundamental right, that means across the United States, the governments could not limit access to abortion. Removing that as a fundamental right means that now individual states can impose restrictions that are even greater than some of the restrictions that had already been in place under the balancing in Roe and Casey. And so what we're seeing now is on a national level, different states are imposing different abortion laws. So, for example, in New York State, abortion remains legal and protected under state law. But in many states across the country, there are bans on abortion, including criminalization, including bans across the board all the way to the very, very beginning of a pregnancy. Some don't even have exceptions for rape and incest. So we have different requirements and restrictions on women's and pregnant people's access to abortion across the states.
Now, as you mentioned, some bans have already gone into effect in several states. What are the penalties? And as you mentioned, it's criminalized. So, what could people be facing if they are looking into abortion?
Now, there's a real range, right? So it's different states have different types of bans. Some of the bans existed. Oh, thank you. That's a great map, right? There are places where abortion remains legal, but there may be legislation pending that might impose restrictions. There are states where there are absolute bans on abortion, including, some of the states you mentioned here where there are criminal penalties, including felonies for the providers. Usually they're aimed at doctors and providers or those who assist abortion services, although there are some threats for penalties against women. And then there are other restrictions, different restrictions in different states. Some restrict abortions at 6 weeks, some at 14 weeks, some at 22 weeks. So there's a real range across state by state, and it creates a great deal of confusion, and it makes access to what is essential, fundamental health care, reproductive care, difficult for many women across the country and confusing, right? And again, I want to say it over and over again. We're here in the Bronx, we're here in New York. Abortion remains legal in New York because under state law, there's a 2019 law that expanded abortion access. Just recently, the legislature in 2022 is trying to provide additional protections and even working to enshrine reproductive rights in the state constitution. But that's New York. People in other states are going to be facing different restrictions.
Right. And in some states, the consequences are very, very harsh. According to ABC News, in Missouri, one could face up to 20 years of imprisonment. And in Texas, it could be something like 99 years plus a fine. How do they come up with these numbers? And why are we seeing such aggressive and harsh penalties for this?
You really have to ask the legislatures. It really boggles the mind that you would have these kinds of penalties related to, again, what is essential reproductive health care. Now, there are those who say, oh, they have religious views of abortion, but that is not something for the states to be regulating. And you see in some of these states, and I see you're pointing out Missouri, you're pointing out Texas. Texas even has a bounty hunter provision that has
Oh, wow.
folks kind of getting access to $10,000 rewards for basically ratting out anybody who assists in someone obtaining an abortion. And, it really is harsh. It's about controlling women. It's it's theocratic. It really has no place. But several states, now that they're free to do so, and there's no restriction under federal constitutional law, will be doing that unless and until people vote out those legislators and ask for something different.
Now, I also want to touch on the fact that in some of these states, of course, it's going to affect the woman looking for it, but it can even affect, a friend or a doctor and possibly even a driver. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, for example, in Texas and I believe in Oklahoma, they also passed a copycat law that imposes penalties and allows for like a bounty hunter structure for those who report on anybody who assists in obtaining abortion. And that could be the doctor or provider. It could be a friend who helps you out. It could be a counselor. It could be even someone, a driver. And they could be subject to what they're calling $10,000 fines, penalties associated with helping to someone to access abortion. And the reason for that is really a chilling effect. It's to stop people from helping out. Now, the other states that are more protective are looking for ways to really limit those provisions and keep them within the states. Those raise federal constitutional issues that I think are really underdeveloped, and we're going to see what happens across different states when, women who are seeking access to reproductive care, to abortion in particular, but to other abortion-related care involving miscarriages, et cetera, try to cross state lines to get care, whether or not some of those really harsh provisions can be limited. So it's a complex web of different laws in different states that are threatening different kinds of penalties. And we'll see, how it plays out. I mean, there's all kinds of litigation going on even now.
Now, as you mentioned, in many of the states where abortion is banned, there is no exception for rape or incest. Do you know if these states have addressed or even adjusted the consequences of those crimes if these women and girls, or, and even pregnant people have to live through or go through with a pregnancy?
I don't know of any provisions that really take into account the human impact. Can you imagine of a forced birth where the pregnancy results from rape or incest? The emotional toll in addition to the medical and just physical everything. And I have not heard of states doing anything really to help women who are in this situation, the children that are born in this kind of situation, the economics, the child, any of that. I really don't see those same legislatures doing anything really to address what these restrictions will do in forcing birth in circumstances that are extraordinarily difficult and will have impacts that go way beyond just when that forced birth happens, but well beyond that, into impacting the lives of those women and their families and loved ones.
And I think that's really unfortunate. And I feel like more people should look into that because I think that, 99 years of even looking into an abortion versus, the consequences somebody has to deal with, I definitely think it needs to be addressed. But thank you so much for sharing that. Now, I want to talk about period tracking apps because it's been on the news a lot lately. Several women are just concerned about their privacy and the release of sensitive information. Can you tell us more about this?
Yeah, it's interesting. There's been a broader conversation about all of our devices, right? We're all hooked on our devices. They help us with all kinds of things, but issues around privacy and access, right? The sort of the aggregation of data, the fact that, things that you're using in social media and other places on your computers, on your laptop, on your phone for free are not really free because one of the things that often goes on without our even knowing it is that our data and our information, including our locations, including everything that we share, right? If we share it, quote unquote, voluntarily, there are third parties, including private corporations and government, that can not only collect that data, but share it, aggregate it, et cetera. And one of the concerns that has come up with period tracking apps and other kinds of apps that track your cycle is that might be used in some of these states that are imposing very severe penalties on abortion access or anything related to abortion access, that would use that as evidence in some way, when they're trying to prosecute those who might assist in terminating a pregnancy. And it's really, when you think about it, it goes so far beyond just those seeking abortion in the narrow set of circumstances that many people think about it. I mean, this is going to have implications for women who face all kinds of medical issues, miscarriage, ectopic pregnancies, everything else. And if there's surveillance going on that's there to serve these penalties, it really can have terrible impacts for women. And so that's an area where you've got to watch it. There isn't the regulation necessarily to protect you. So be careful, especially if you're in one of these states that has these very restrictive and punitive bans.
Now, should people be worried using these apps when they say, because sometimes they do tell you, and we often don't read those policies, but they'll say that they may use your personal information to comply with applicable laws, lawful requests, and legal process, such as to respond to subpoenas or requests from the government. And sometimes they'll say that they have a legal obligation. I know a lot of people don't understand what that means, but should they be worried if they see that in an app that they're using?
Yes, better not to share any sensitive information in any app that you have if you are not completely sure that it's secure. And I'm telling you, we can't be completely sure these days that it's secure, because I don't know about you, but a lot of people, they say in order to use this, you've got to kind of check off on our privacy policy. Often those privacy policies say we can share, and we do share this information in certain places. And that includes, there's often a legal obligation. If there's a criminal penalty or a criminal, restriction on some kind of action, and they seek to use that information, you're not necessarily guaranteed. And I don't think the law has caught up with the ability to use that sensitive data for these kinds of things. And so I would say, yeah, you should be careful in terms of using, those kinds of apps and other mechanisms in your computer and your phone, et cetera, that could be accessed by third parties.
Now, I want to talk about the LGBTQ community for a little bit. Can you just explain how does abortion rights affects this community and how they're linked?
Yeah, there's a link. So when we talked about the fundamental right to abortion, that right was situated in the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution that says no state shall deny life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And that liberty interest includes bodily autonomy, but under law, under precedents that include and that are related to Roe and Casey that we're talking about, that included substantive due process rights to contraceptive, to have contraceptions, to intimate personal relations, intimate sexual relations, forming your family, marriage, interracial marriage, and same-sex marriage, all the protections of all of those personal rights, those really close to your heart personal rights, spring from substantive due process, right? Including same-sex marriage, including, those kinds of intimate relationships where the government under the Constitution so far cannot tread, right? And so with overturning Roe v. Wade, even though Justice Alito in the majority opinion says, oh, this is limited to just abortion rights, that's not how the law works. And Justice Thomas in a concurrence was pretty overt in saying that his goal, and maybe others, and they're not saying it yet, is to really, pare down and roll back a whole series of protections, liberty interests, bodily autonomy interests, personal and family interest protections under the rubric of substantive due process in the 14th Amendment to the Constitution.
Now, there's so much to learn about this. How can people stay knowledgeable about the abortion laws in their state?
It's a great question. There are a number of organizations that track what is going on in the states. So there are legal organizations that have been engaged, because it's really a patchwork right now, right? And so there are some states where, say, a dormant law came into effect or a trigger law came into effect, but then there's a legal challenge. So organizations like the Center for Reproductive Rights, like If, When, How, Lawyers for Reproductive Justice, like the ACLU Reproductive Freedom Project, track the laws. The other organizations also track kind of the policy and facts, right? People really don't understand the scope of what's affected when we're talking about abortion rights, right? so many women, right, are, it's women with children already. It's women with families. It's people from all kinds of religious backgrounds who really seek access to abortion and other reproductive care. But I would say you can track those organizations that are really following closely what's going on state by state. I'm going to say it again. In New York, abortion remains legal because under state law, abortion access is legal. But yes, if you're going traveling, if you're going to think about moving to another state, you want to take a look and see what's going on, especially if you are a woman, it's mostly young women, who may need access to care. You want to sort of keep track of where that stands in other states across the country.
All right, Professor, thank you so much for bringing us information.
Thank you for having me.
We'll be right back with more Open BxRx Tuesday.